Imagine this, the skies above Iran, erupting in fire, missiles streaking across the night, and an air force, once feared, brought to its knees in hours. Precision strikes, chaos on the ground, and the world watching as history is rewritten in real time. What led to this unprecedented attack? How did the United States unleash hell? And what does it mean for the region and the world? Stay with us, because what you are about to see will change everything you thought you knew about modern warfare. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. A war history documentary speech. Ladies and gentlemen, war rarely begins with a single explosion. It begins with tension, quiet, building pressure beneath the surface of history. For decades, the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran circled each other like rival powers, trapped in a long shadow of suspicion. From the embers of the Iranian Revolution to the proxy conflicts that stretched across the Middle East, their rivalry hardened into one of the most dangerous standoffs of the modern era. But then, the skies over Iran changed. In early 2026, the world watched as a new and devastating phase of conflict erupted, a confrontation now widely referred to as the 2026 Iran War. What began with coordinated strikes quickly escalated into one of the most intense air campaigns the region had ever witnessed. And in those opening days, the United States unleashed overwhelming force. The night, the sky turned to fire. It started before dawn. Far above the Persian Gulf, radar screens lit up like constellations. Stealth bombers, cruise missiles, electronic warfare aircraft, all moving in perfect coordination. From American carriers and distant bases, waves of precision-guided weapons streaked toward Iranian military infrastructure, air bases, radar stations, command centers. The mission was simple in theory: destroy Iran's ability to control its own skies. But in reality, it was something far more dramatic. Within hours, explosions echoed across strategic sites in cities like Tehran, Isfahan, and Kermanshah. Military runways cracked under the impact of bunker-buster bombs. Fighter jets never even left the ground. What unfolded was not just an attack, it was the systematic dismantling of an air force. According to U.S. systematic dismantling of an air force. Defense officials, the campaign crippled Iran's air and naval capabilities within days, leaving large parts of its military command structure in chaos and unable to coordinate large-scale operations. The Iranian Air Force, built largely on aircraft designed decades earlier, suddenly found itself facing the most technologically advanced military force on Earth, and it was losing. The human side of air war, but war is never only about machines. Behind every radar screen sits a human being. Imagine the Iranian pilot scrambling toward his aircraft as sirens howl through the base. Imagine the ground crew racing across the runway under the orange glow of distant explosions. They know something terrible is happening. They know the sky itself has turned hostile. Missiles arrive faster than decisions can be made. Runways vanish in clouds of fire. Communication towers collapse, leaving commanders shouting into silent radios. Within hours, coordination begins to fail. Within days, entire squadrons become useless. Not destroyed in battle, but stranded without infrastructure. This is what modern air dominance looks like. Not dramatic dogfights, but silent paralysis. The strategy behind the storm, military historians will study this campaign for years. The American strategy followed a familiar doctrine, first developed during operations like Operation Desert Storm, known as air supremacy through system destruction. Instead of fighting enemy aircraft directly, the goal is to destroy everything that allows them to function. By-kick radar networks, fike air defense systems, fike fuel depots, air defense systems, communications, infrastructure take away those pieces. And even a powerful air force becomes blind. That is exactly what happened. Strike after strike dismantled Iran's ability to detect incoming aircraft or coordinate defenses. Analysts noted that missile launches and drone attacks from Iran rapidly dropped after the initial phase of the campaign, evidence that command and control networks had been severely disrupted. The skies were no longer contested. They were dominated. The war spreads across the region, but wars never stay contained. Iran responded the way nations often do when struck hard, with retaliation. Missiles and drones surged across the Middle East toward American bases and allied nations, including attacks across countries like Kuwait, Jordan, Qatar, and Bahrain. Air defense systems lit up across the region. Intercepts filled the night sky. Explosions echoed from deserts to coastlines. The conflict was no longer just an air campaign over Iran. It had become a regional war. A devastated air force in Washington, millions described the result in stark terms. Iran's once proud air force, already aging and under sanctions for decades, had been shattered. Airfields damaged, airfields destroyed or grounded, command networks broken. According to U.S. officials, the Iranian Air Force effectively ceased to function as a coordinated fighting force within the opening phase of the war. For a nation that once aspired to dominate the skies of the Persian Gulf, it was a staggering blow. But history warns us yet. History teaches a difficult lesson. Winning the sky does not always mean winning the war. Air power can cripple infrastructure. It can destroy armies. It can dominate territory. But it cannot easily destroy an idea or the will of a nation to resist. From Vietnam to Afghanistan, to resist. From Vietnam to Afghanistan to Iraq, the United States has learned that military superiority does not always guarantee political victory. And Iran, a nation shaped by centuries of invasion, revolution, and resistance, is unlikely to surrender its identity easily. The uncertain future tonight. Historians may one day look back on these days as a turning point, perhaps the moment when one of the Middle East's most powerful militaries lost control of its skies, or perhaps the moment when a much larger and more dangerous conflict began. Because once the fires of war ignite, they rarely burn where leaders expect. The skies above Iran may have fallen silent, but the echoes of this war are only beginning. If you stillness in these words, subscribe to join the space of presence and share you deepest now in the comments below. Decades of tension between the United States and Iran did not arise overnight. They were forged in the crucible of history, in the turbulent events of the 20th century, shaped by revolution, ideology, and an enduring struggle for influence in a region vital to global geopolitics. To understand why the skies above Iran would one day become a theater of fire and destruction, one must first trace the arc of this tense relationship, beginning with the foundations laid in the early 1950s, a period when Iran was already wrestling with its own identity and aspirations in the shadow of foreign powers. In 1953, Iran faced a pivotal moment in its modern history. Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, a nationalist leader, moved decisively to nationalize the country's oil industry, ending decades of British control through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. This bold step, intended to assert Iranian sovereignty and economic independence, alarmed Western powers who relied heavily on Middle Eastern oil, particularly the United Kingdom and the United States. In response, the Central Intelligence Agency, in coordination with British intelligence, orchestrated Operation Ajax, a covert coup that removed Mossadegh from power and reinstated Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi with extraordinary authority For the Iranian people, this intervention was not merely a political maneuver, it was an indelible mark of foreign interference, a bitter memory that would shape Iranian attitudes toward the United States for decades to come. Mossadegh had become a symbol of Iranian self-determination, and his removal was a wound that would fester in the national consciousness. The Shah's regime, bolstered by U.S. support, embarked on ambitious modernization programs focusing on industrialization, military expansion, and the creation of a strong central state. Yet these reforms, while transformative, also generated resentment. The rapid modernization clashed with traditional structures and religious authorities, and the Shah's authoritarian tendencies fostered a climate of fear and political repression. The U.S., meanwhile, continued to provide military aid, training, and intelligence support, entrenching a relationship that was seen domestically in Iran as one-sided and extractive. American advisors walked the halls of Iranian ministries. American arms filled Iranian arsenals, and American influence seemed omnipresent, guiding policy behind the facade of sovereignty. By the late 1970s, the accumulation of grievances, political, social, and economic, ignited a revolution that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of U.S.-Iran relations. The Iranian Revolution of 1979, led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, was both a popular uprising and a religious resurgence. It overthrew the Shah, ending decades of monarchical rule, and established the Islamic Republic of Iran. The revolution was not only anti-Shah, it was explicitly anti-American. The United States, perceived as the Shah's chief supporter and a symbol of imperialist intervention, became the focal point of Iranian revolutionary anger. The seizure of the U.S. embassy in Tehran and the hostage crisis that followed, lasting 444 days, shocked the world and cemented a narrative of mutual distrust. For the U.S., Iran had transformed from an ally into a hostile state. For Iran, America had proven itself a manipulative power willing to undermine sovereignty for its own strategic interests. The 1980s brought further escalation as regional conflict and ideological divergence compounded the existing tension. The Iran-Iraq War, which raged from 1980 to 1988, positioned the United States indirectly against Iran, despite a complex web of alliances and covert operations. The U.S. provided support to Iraq through intelligence sharing, arms sales, and diplomatic backing, framing the conflict in Cold War terms as a necessary stance against a revolutionary regime. Iranian leaders, interpreting these actions as deliberate attempts to weaken their nation, hardened their stance, embedding a deep-seated suspicion of American intentions into their strategic thinking. During this period, both nations also engaged in a shadow war, with incidents such as the mining of the Persian Gulf, attacks on oil tankers, and confrontations in the Strait of Hormuz, demonstrating that conflict could erupt quickly if miscalculations occurred. The 1990s and early 2000s did not alleviate the strain. While the world watched the Gulf War and later the U.S. invasion of Iraq, Iran viewed American actions with a mixture of caution and resentment. USA sanctions intensified, targeting Iranian economic and military development, while Iran pursued its own strategic ambitions, including the expansion of missile capabilities and support for allied groups in the region. Each move was interpreted by the other side as provocative, contributing to a cycle of suspicion that left little room for diplomacy. American policymakers framed Iran as a state sponsor of terrorism, pointing to Hezbollah in Lebanon, Shiite militias in Iraq, and other proxies while Iranian leaders cited a history of foreign intervention as justification for self-reliance and military preparedness. The rhetoric hardened, and the narratives on both sides became self-reinforcing, emphasizing existential threat and moral imperative. The nuclear question in the 2000s brought these tensions to the forefront of international concern. As Iran developed nuclear technology, the United States and its allies expressed fears that the program could lead to weapons development, further destabilizing the region. Sanctions deepened, diplomacy oscillated with suspicion, and Iran's leaders, invoking national pride and resistance to coercion, refused to halt their ambitions entirely. Each negotiation, each failed agreement, each public statement became another layer in the dense fabric of distrust that defined U.S.-Iran relations. Analysts and historians would later note that the seeds of direct confrontation, including air campaigns and targeted strikes, were sown in this period of escalating strategic friction. By the mid-2010s, the relationship had shifted in some ways, but hardened in others. Agreements like the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPO, offered temporary reprieves, but the underlying mistrust remained. The United States continued to view Iran's military and regional influence with caution, while Iran perceived American involvement in Middle Eastern conflicts, sanctions, and military presence in neighboring countries as direct threats. Both nations accumulated technological capabilities, regional alliances, and strategic doctrines that would later define the conduct of modern warfare. In this context, the possibility of direct confrontation, while undesirable to both sides, became increasingly plausible, particularly as events in the 2020s escalated tensions in ways that mirrored the historical patterns of mutual suspicion, retaliation, and ideological confrontation. Through decades of revolution, war, diplomacy, and mistrust, the stage was set for a dramatic confrontation. The United States and Iran, each carrying the weight of history, each shaped by decades of tension, faced each other not merely as contemporary adversaries, but as the culmination of decades of unresolved grievances, ideological conflict, and competing visions for the future of the Middle East. Every policy, every military exercise, every intelligence report carried echoes of history, and when the moment finally came for direct military engagement, the memories of coups, revolutions, proxy wars, and sanctions all converged in the minds of leaders and strategists on both sides, driving decisions with the force of centuries of unresolved tension. If you stillness in these words, subscribe to join the space of presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. The night of the air assault arrived like a shadow creeping across the Persian skies, a silent prelude to devastation. It was not announced, not signaled by any warning sirens, and for most of the civilians and soldiers on the ground in Iran, it began with a tension that seemed almost imperceptible at first. Radar operators in Tehran, Isfahan, and Kermanshah noticed anomalies on their screens, tiny blips moving with precision, unlike anything their systems had detected before. In the command centers, commanders exchanged uneasy glances, aware that the warnings, subtle as they were, could signify the opening moves of a carefully orchestrated strike. In the hours before dawn, the American military had already moved into position, its forces poised over the Persian Gulf and from forward bases across the region, ready to launch a campaign that would redefine air warfare in the Middle East. The assault began with stealth bombers gliding silently over the desert, their engines almost imperceptible against the night air. Simultaneously, cruise missiles, each programmed with the coordinates of critical infrastructure, streaked toward Iran like fiery harbingers of destruction. Electronic warfare aircraft accompanied the strike, jamming communications, blinding radars, and ensuring that the defenses on the ground would not have the advantage of reaction time. The operation was the culmination of years of planning, rehearsed simulations, and intelligence gathering. Every airfield, radar station, missile silo, and command center had been analyzed for vulnerabilities. The result was a strike so precise that each target, even if heavily fortified, could be neutralized within minutes, leaving minimal opportunity for repair or counteraction. On the ground, the human dimension of the assault became evident within the first hour. At air bases, pilots, and ground, D crews scrambled to respond to the sudden onslaught. Sirens wailed, lights flashed, and the roar of incoming munitions shattered the calm of early morning. Aircraft that had sat on runways for decades, aging but ready, were destroyed before their engines could even start. Runways were cratered by bunker-buster bombs, leaving strips of cracked concrete that would be unusable for weeks or months. Fuel depots erupted into firestorms, sending columns of black smoke rising into the sky, visible even from distant cities. Command centers, often designed to withstand conventional attacks, were neutralized by the precision and coordination of the strikes. In mere minutes, the intricate networks that allowed Iran to control its air power had been dismantled, leaving pilots and soldiers in a state of confusion and fear. From the perspective of those in the United States, the strike was a demonstration of technological and strategic mastery. Military analysts monitored the operation in real time, noting the speed, accuracy, and efficiency with which targets were destroyed. Satellite imagery, drones, and other reconnaissance tools allowed commanders to confirm hits almost instantly. It was a display of modern air supremacy, a calculated application of overwhelming force designed to achieve maximum effect while minimizing the exposure of American personnel. The doctrine behind the assault had been refined over decades, drawing lessons from previous conflicts, and it was executed with a precision that left even experienced military observers in awe. The coordination between air, naval, and electronic assets ensured that each strike complemented the next, creating a cascading effect that overwhelmed the Iranian defensive systems before they could organize a coherent response. The psychological impact of the assault on Iranian forces cannot be overstated. Soldiers stationed at the bases trained for months or years suddenly found themselves facing a type of warfare that was almost unimaginable. Radar operators trained to detect and respond to incoming threats were confronted with systems that could not distinguish between decoys and real missiles, between fake blips and actual bombers, Pilots, whose training had relied on the assumption of coordinated ground control, were suddenly isolated, unable to receive orders or guidance. The confusion and fear spread quickly, as each successful strike destroyed not just physical infrastructure, but also the morale and cohesion of the defending forces. The human element of the assault, the uncertainty, the panic, the impossibility of immediate response, was as devastating as the bombs themselves. The assault also demonstrated the vulnerabilities of even a well-established military infrastructure when faced with modern, coordinated air power. Iran had invested in air defense systems, radar arrays, and hardened shelters, yet these measures proved insufficient against the integrated approach of the U.S. forces. The combination of stealth, electronic warfare, and precision munitions meant that traditional defensive strategies were largely ineffective. Command centers that had been the nerve centers of Iranian air operations were quickly rendered silent. Communication lines essential for coordinating defense across multiple sites were disrupted. Missiles that might have been launched in retaliation were intercepted, misdirected, or delayed, further compounding the chaos. Within a single night, the perception of invulnerability that had sustained the Iranian Air Force for decades was shattered. The civilian population, while not the direct target, also experienced the shockwaves of the attack. In cities close to air bases, distant explosions rattled windows and shook buildings. Emergency services struggled to respond as fires broke out and communication networks became unreliable. The night sky, once a canvas of stars, was transformed into a tableau of light and fire, a visual testament to the destructive power of modern warfare. For ordinary Iranians, the assault was both frightening and incomprehensible, a sudden intrusion of war into daily life, showing the reach and impact of conflicts fought far above the ground. They walked on. As the night unfolded, the systematic nature of the assault became evident. It was not chaotic or impulsive. Every strike was deliberate, every target chosen with an understanding of both its immediate and strategic significance. Radar installations were neutralized first, removing the ability to detect incoming aircraft. Then came the airfields and runways, ensuring that even undamaged aircraft could not take off. Fuel and ammunition depots were destroyed to prevent resupply or counterattacks. Command and control centers were targeted to disrupt coordination across the Air Force. By the end of the initial phase, the Iranian air defense network, once thought robust and resilient, was fragmented, with units unable to communicate, respond, or regroup effectively. In Washington and Allied command centers, military officials monitored the effectiveness of the operation with a mixture of professional satisfaction and strategic caution. The night had demonstrated the lethality and precision of modern air campaigns, yet the broader implications were clear. While the immediate objectives had been achieved, the regional and global consequences would unfold in unpredictable ways. Iran's capacity to retaliate had been diminished, yet the potential for escalation, regional instability, and international response remained ever present. Even as the last wave of strikes hit their targets before dawn, the reality of what had been unleashed, the destruction, the disruption, the human cost, was only beginning to settle across the region and in the minds of those who had executed the plan. If you stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. The collapse of Iran's air power unfolded not in a single dramatic dogfight, but through a relentless orchestration of strategy, technology, and timing, leaving the nation's air force crippled and uncoordinated in a matter of hours. The first wave of strikes had already created a landscape of shattered runways, smoldering hangars, and smoke-filled command centers. But what followed was the systematic dismantling of every mechanism that had allowed Iran to project power through the skies. The destruction was surgical, calculated, and merciless, exposing the vulnerability of even a long-established military force to the integrated might of modern air operations. In the initial hours of the campaign, Iranian pilots who had trained for years to fly high-performance fighters were grounded before they could even taxi to the runway. Fuel depots, carefully camouflaged and fortified, were obliterated by precision-guided bombs, leaving the aircraft stranded and useless. Hangars collapsed under the force of bunker busters, and aging jets were reduced to twisted metal, their wings and fuselages scorched black by explosions. Pilots, many of them seasoned veterans, were forced to confront a reality they had never anticipated. Their air force, once a symbol of national pride, was paralyzed, incapable of carrying out even basic defensive maneuvers. Radar installations, which formed the backbone of Iran's air defense network, were neutralized almost simultaneously, These systems had been designed to detect incoming threats and guide interceptors to their targets, but they were systematically jammed, blinded, and destroyed by a combination of electronic warfare aircraft and precise kinetic strikes. Operators trained to maintain situational awareness in the face of high-pressure scenarios suddenly found themselves working with malfunctioning equipment and conflicting signals. Communications lines were severed, leaving scattered units unable to coordinate with each other or with central command. In the absence of reliable radar and communication, even experienced air defense crews became ineffective firing missiles at phantom targets or missing actual threats entirely. Within hours, the once cohesive network had fractured into isolated nodes, each struggling to function independently, but without the structure needed to mount a meaningful response. The effect on morale was immediate and devastating. Soldiers and technicians, many of whom had devoted their lives to the Air Force, witnessed the destruction of infrastructure they had spent years maintaining. They saw aircraft destroyed while still on the ground, saw radar towers collapse in flames, and heard the roar of missiles tearing through their airfields. Confusion, fear, and disbelief rippled through the ranks, compounded by the realization that the attacks were not random but meticulously planned. The psychological toll of being powerless to protect one's own base, one's own colleagues and one's own colleagues and one's own nation was as crippling as the physical damage inflicted by the bombs. In many cases, personnel abandoned posts or froze under the stress, unable to respond to orders that could not reach them. Command and control, the heart of any organized military effort, was virtually destroyed. Centralized operations rooms that coordinated fighter sorties, air defense missile launches, and reconnaissance flights were hit early, leaving the Iranian Air Force without effective leadership. Decisions that had previously taken minutes or hours became impossible to make. Pilots in the air, if any were airborne, had no guidance, no communication with base, and no coordinated plan. Ground units tasked with air defense operated without knowledge of what other units were doing, sometimes firing missiles blindly into the sky, wasting resources and further revealing their positions. The collapse was not due to a lack of personnel or skill, but to the disintegration of the systems that allowed those personnel to function effectively. With command centers destroyed, radars disabled, and communications severed, even the most skilled officers were powerless to restore operational capability. The technological superiority of the U.S. forces played a decisive role in this collapse. Precision-guided munitions ensured that critical targets were destroyed on the first attempt, minimizing the chance of repair or quick replacement. Stealth aircraft penetrated airspace without detection, striking deep within bases that were considered secure. Electronic warfare measures rendered long-range missiles and air defenses almost useless by jamming radar frequencies and confusing automated targeting systems. The combination of kinetic strikes and electronic disruption created a scenario where the Iranian Air Force could not mount a coordinated defense, and attempts to respond were disorganized and largely ineffective. By the end of the initial assault, the Air Force had not only lost aircraft, but had lost the infrastructure, command, and communications that defined its ability to function as a cohesive entity. The scale of the destruction also highlighted the limitations inherent in Iran's Air Force, much of which had been developed over decades with older technology and under the constraints of international sanctions. Aircraft were aging, spare parts were scarce, and maintenance crews often struggled to keep planes airworthy. Air defense systems, while formidable on paper, were designed to counter conventional attacks and were not prepared for the multi-layered, technologically advanced offensive they faced. While the Iranian military had invested in redundancy and hardening measures, the precision and coordination of the U.S. campaign exploited vulnerabilities in every layer of defense. The result was a rapid and near total incapacitation of air capabilities, not by attrition over months of battle, but within the span of a single night. In addition to the physical and operational collapse, the human dimension of this defeat was profound. Pilots, technicians, and commanders were forced to confront the failure of their training, the inadequacy of their equipment, and the sudden impotence of their institutions. Some attempted ad hoc measures to restore communication or repair damaged equipment, but the scale of destruction and the speed of the assault made such efforts futile. Across multiple bases, personnel documented the chaos, recording accounts of fire, smoke, and relentless explosions that tore through the fabric of their air force. The emotional and psychological impact of seeing one's own military infrastructure disintegrate so completely created a sense of despair that spread across units and regions. Even as the first phase of the assault ended, the consequences continued to unfold. Air bases that were partially damaged became unusable due to compromised runways, destroyed fuel supplies, and disrupted maintenance facilities. Aircraft that survived the initial strike remained grounded due to the loss of operational command and the scarcity of essential resources. Radar systems, even if partially functional, were insufficient to coordinate meaningful air defense. Attempts to launch retaliatory strikes were hampered by confusion and miscommunication, leaving Iranian forces effectively paralyzed. In military terms, the Air Force had ceased to exist as a coordinated fighting entity. Its planes could not fly in meaningful formations. Its missiles could not be targeted effectively, and its leadership could not command from centralized positions. The collapse was both total and immediate, a striking example of how modern air campaigns can achieve strategic objectives with precision and speed. The broader implications of this collapse extended beyond the military sphere. Regional actors, allies, and adversaries alike observed the speed and effectiveness of the operation, recalculating their assumptions about Iran's capacity to defend itself. The perception of air superiority had shifted dramatically, influencing diplomatic, strategic, and psychological calculations across the Middle East. Within Iran, the collapse reverberated not only through military ranks but through the national consciousness, challenging the narrative of invincibility and revealing the fragility of power when confronted with overwhelming technological and strategic force. If you stillness in these words, subscribe to join the space of presence and share you deepest now in the comments below. Even as the dust settled over Iran's shattered airfields and the roar of explosions faded into the distance, the consequences of the assault remained uncertain, heavy with the weight of history and human cost. War does not conclude when bombs cease to fall. It lingers in the minds of those who witness it, in the strategies of nations, and in the unpredictable currents of regional politics. The immediate military victory, the demonstration of overwhelming power, was only the beginning. Beyond the physical destruction, beyond the smoke and fire, lay a landscape of ambiguity where every action carried the potential to ripple far beyond the battlefield, creating outcomes no strategist could fully predict. In Tehran, Isfahan, and other affected cities, civilians awoke to a reality transformed. Buildings were damaged, power lines severed, and communications intermittent. Fires smoldered across military complexes, sending acrid smoke into neighborhoods, and emergency services struggled to respond amid widespread chaos. Ordinary citizens who had long lived under the shadow of international tension and military posturing now confronted the immediacy of war in their own streets. The psychological impact was profound, a mixture of fear, anger, and disbelief as families grappled with the fact that the distant strategies of nations had now manifested in their homes. Children who had previously known only rumors of conflict now heard the echoes of bombs, and adults faced the challenge of ensuring safety amid uncertainty. The civilian experience of war, often overlooked in strategic discussions, revealed the human dimension of a conflict that had so far been analyzed in terms of aircraft, missiles, and radar systems. Regionally, the response was equally complex and unpredictable. Neighboring countries watched closely, calculating their own positions in a rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape. Some feared that the conflict could spill beyond Iran's borders, drawing in allies, proxies, and coalition forces in a larger confrontation. Others viewed the events as a demonstration of the military capabilities of the United States, recalibrating their own strategies and alliances in response. The air assault had altered the balance of power in the region, but whether that shift would stabilize or destabilize the Middle East remained unclear. In such a volatile environment, even small miscalculations could trigger broader escalation, and every action, whether diplomatic, military, or economic, carried heightened significance. For Iran's leadership, the collapse of the Air Force and the immediate shock of the strikes demanded urgent decision-making under conditions of extreme uncertainty. The government faced questions that had no easy answers. How to respond without provoking even more devastating retaliation? How to respond without provoking even more devastating retaliation? How to preserve national sovereignty and dignity in the face of humiliation? And how to reassure a population shaken by fear and loss. Each choice involved trade-offs between military strategy, political stability, and public perception. Responding too aggressively risked further destruction, while inaction could be perceived as weakness. This tension between the need for decisive action and the danger of miscalculation defined the early hours and days following the assault, as leaders weighed options with incomplete information and under immense pressure. Beyond the immediate military and political considerations, the assault raised questions about the long-term consequences for regional security. The temporary neutralization of Iran's air force created a vacuum in the Persian Gulf and surrounding areas, one that could influence shipping routes, trade, and the posture of other military forces. Allies of the United States might interpret the events as an opportunity to consolidate influence, while adversaries could perceive vulnerabilities to exploit. The air campaign, while successful in achieving its immediate objectives, did not resolve the underlying tensions that had accumulated over decades. History had shown that removing one element of military power does not necessarily eliminate conflict. Rather, it often shifts the dynamics, creating new challenges and unforeseen outcomes. The global response also introduced layers of complexity and uncertainty. International observers, from the United Nations to neighboring powers, expressed concern about escalation, civilian casualties, and the broader implications for stability. Some nations called for restraint and diplomacy, while others analyzed the situation in terms of strategic advantage, weighing the consequences for energy markets, alliances, and regional influence. The assault served as a stark reminder that military action, particularly in a region as interconnected and volatile as the Middle East, rarely has isolated effects. Every strike carried potential diplomatic repercussions. Every destroyed airfield became a symbol in a broader narrative of power, and every moment of tactical success had to be considered in the context of long-term strategy and international reaction. The uncertainty also extended to the human dimension within Iran's military, with the Air Force paralyzed and command structures disrupted. Individual officers and soldiers faced the challenge of adapting to an unprecedented situation. Some attempted to regroup, improvising communication networks and organizing small-scale defensive measures, but the speed and precision of the American strikes limited the effectiveness of such efforts. Frustration, fear, and a sense of futility pervaded the ranks. The collapse of traditional command and control forced personnel to make decisions independently, often with incomplete information and under extreme stress. These conditions not only affected immediate military performance but also shaped longer-term perceptions of capability, trust, and resilience within the armed forces. Economically, the aftermath of the assault introduced additional uncertainty. Military infrastructure, already expensive to maintain and limited by years of sanctions, had been destroyed or severely damaged. Rebuilding airfields, replacing aircraft, restoring radar systems, and re-establishing command centers would require significant resources and time. Iran faced the dual challenge of repairing physical damage while maintaining essential governmental and civilian functions, all under the watchful eyes of the international community. The strain on the economy, compounded by potential retaliatory actions or continued regional instability, created a complex web of pressures that would influence both domestic and foreign policy decisions in the months and years to come. The assault also prompted reflections on the evolving nature of modern warfare. The collapse of Iran's air power demonstrated the effectiveness of integrated, technologically sophisticated operations that combine stealth, precision, and electronic warfare. Yet it also underscored the limitations of military force in achieving political resolution. The destruction of aircraft and infrastructure, while strategically significant, did not resolve underlying political disputes, ideological conflicts, or the broader struggle for influence in the region. Military victory, impressive as it was, left open a range of possibilities for escalation, counterattacks, and protracted conflict, highlighting the inherent uncertainty that accompanies modern air campaigns. For the global community, the events of that night served as a reminder of the precarious balance between deterrence, power projection, and diplomacy. The ability to cripple an adversary's air force demonstrated extraordinary technological and strategic capability, but it also illuminated the fragile nature of regional stability. Analysts debated whether the assault would lead to deterrence, further escalation, or a protracted struggle in which conventional victories might be insufficient to achieve long-term objectives. The night of destruction became a case study in the complex interplay between tactical success and strategic uncertainty, illustrating that even decisive military action cannot fully control the cascade of consequences that follows. Psychologically, the uncertainty of the aftermath weighed heavily on leaders, soldiers, and civilians alike. In Iran, the populace grappled with fear, uncertainty, and anger, while leadership confronted the need to project resilience despite the blow to national pride. In the United States, planners and strategists monitored outcomes carefully, aware that even a flawlessly executed air campaign could trigger unpredictable political, economic, and military consequences. Across the Middle East and the world, observers assessed the implications for alliances, regional power dynamics, and the potential for future confrontations. The collapse of air power, while tactically decisive, opened a landscape of ambiguity that would challenge decision-makers at every level, revealing that in modern conflict, certainty is never absolute, and victory in one domain does not guarantee control over the broader consequences of war. If you stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence and share you deepest now in the comments below. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.